Hi, thank you so much for your interest in our paper entitled How Do We Know What They Know? A Case Study of Classroom-Based Assessment with Multilingual Learners. I am Colleen Fitzpatrick. I am at the University of Toledo. My co-authors are Stephanie Van Hover at the University of Virginia, Vonna Hemler at Amherst College, and Ariel Cornett at Georgia Southern University. This manuscript should be published in a forthcoming volume of TRSE. I want to kind of set the stage for the study. Imagine yourself, it's late spring, it's a month or two away from state testing time. You walk into an 11th grade United States history classroom. It's the fourth day of an 8-day unit on World War I, the 1920s, and the Great Depression. The lesson ran long on day 3, so day 4 includes the end of a lecture on the Treaty of Versailles, followed by small group station activities about the 1920s. It's pre-pandemic, so students are without masks and sitting in groups of their choice in preparation for the station activity. Prey and Shannon, pencils in hand, are sitting next to each other, seemingly attentive to the teacher, Mrs. Book, and taking notes from the PowerPoint projected at the front of the class. Another student, Min, is sitting in a group of 3 other boys. He is not facing Mrs. Book and is not writing anything down. He and his friends are answering her questions, though. Min calls out, "It's a big castle," when Mrs. Book asks, "What is Versailles?" Here and there, Min looks at his friend's notes and appears to write down what he sees on his friend's paper. For most of the lecture, Arya is on her phone and eating cookies, and when Mrs. Book asks the class if they have any questions about the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, Arya is deep in conversation with friends. So our focus for this study, it's 4 students in the same class with the same teacher looking at the same PowerPoint. It's 4 students who took the same chapter quiz, the same unit test, and will take the same high-stakes end-of-course test. But these 4 students, did they experience the unit in the same way? How did their individual experiences translate to assessment results, and did they learn? So our focus is to explore the problem posed by S.G. Grant, who observed that as a field, social studies has spent considerable time talking about content, teaching, and learning, but we struggle with the question of how to know what students know. Investigating this question is important to try to surface the often invisible processes involved in acquiring new knowledge, new skills, and new conceptual understandings. So this study takes place in a Virginia and U.S. history class in grade 11. It has a high stakes end of course examination called the Standard of Learning. We call it the SOL, and it is taught by Mrs. Book, a veteran teacher who's been in the classroom for over 10 years, most of it teaching Virginia and U.S. history. All 4 of our students identified as multilingual learners. This was not our original intention. When we asked Mrs. Book to identify 4 students in the classroom to participate, she chose these 4 students who were all multilingual learners. This is representative of the growing number of multilingual learners in U.S. public classrooms, and teachers can often misperceive the needs of these learners and incorrectly assume the extent of their background knowledge. These students can bring different cultural and conceptual assumptions to the classroom, and assessments can often present a linguistic challenge for these students. So these 4 focal students are Preya, Arya, Shannon, and Min. They all self-identified as a multilingual learner, but they're all coming from different backgrounds. Preya is a female. This is her first year in the United States, originally coming from India. This is her first history class in the United States. Arya is a female from the Ukraine. She's lived in the United States for 7 years. Shannon is a female. She's from the United States, but she identifies as bilingual. She speaks both Spanish and English fluently. Min is a male from Malaysia. He has lived in the United States for 5 years. Our data collection, we began with a pre-interview with our teacher, Mrs. Book, where we asked what her objectives were, what she wanted the students to know, understand, and be able to do at the end of the unit. We then had follow-up interviews with her throughout the unit, asking clarifying questions, and she participated in a post-unit interview where she thought through the test and reflected on how the unit went. We observed 8 days of instruction. There were 2 video cameras situated throughout the classroom. And there was an observer that was there taking detailed field notes, and each focal student had an audio recorder on their desk to capture any student to student or student to teacher interaction that we would have missed on the video cameras or the observer would have missed. We also got numerous artifacts. So we had all of the assessments that the students took, a pre-assessment on the first day, their post-assessment on day 9 of the unit. They took a quiz a couple days into the unit. Any notes that the students took on lectures, on videos that Mrs. Book showed, that they took on textbook readings. We also got any of the classroom handouts, um, a, a map that she gave on World War I, a worksheet on the Zimmerman telegram, their stations handout from the 4th day, and an entrance pass that they had to submit on day 7. We also got copies of all of her PowerPoints. At the end of the unit, students participated in a think aloud interview of the summative assessment. They were asked what the correct answer was, why they knew it was the correct answer, and where they remember that information coming up in the classroom. So there were 10 questions that were on both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment, which we focused in our analysis. So these 10 questions we coded for the content that was covered, as well as the SOL that the question was related to. We also then coded it for when it would have been covered in the class, or when the students would have had we called them instructional interactions. So did they, learn about this through a movie, through a lecture, through reading the textbook? Essentially, Mrs. Book taught to the test, and every topic is covered during classroom instruction, some of them multiple different times. So our study is purposely focusing in on classroom as it exists in real life. It's not an intervention study. We wanted to look at what was happening and how we know what students know. So Mrs. Book engaged in what we call multiple choice teaching. She lectured, she provided worksheets to prepare students for a multiple choice test. We relied on teacher development, classwork, and assessments similar to the seminal work of Graham Nuttall and Adrian Alton Lee from the 1990s. In an 8-day unit, she relied on 2 measures, the Chapter 9 quiz and the unit test, to assess the student learning. All other assignments received a completion grade. This is not to portray Mrs. Book in a negative light. This is what classrooms look like on a regular day-to-day basis. Teachers can be very overwhelmed with the amount of grading when you have 125 students in the classroom. We recognize this, but we wanted to contextualize it and paint the larger picture of the classroom. Within the 10 questions that appeared on both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment, it's clear that the students learned the post-test, and then it becomes a little fuzzier when we get to the interview. 2 of the students answered more questions correctly in the interview. They answered different questions correctly. And so when we dig further into it, we look at what the students already knew before the unit. So this mirrors what previous research has shown, that students know about 40%. Here they knew a little less, about 40% of content information before a unit begins. There are things that were not learned, things that they got correct on the test but didn't remember by the interview, things that they learned and remembered throughout, things that they forgot by the time the interview rolled around. But the scores do not capture the uniqueness and the individual learning experiences of students. We do note that the over-reliance on one approach of assessment is not good assessment practice and doesn't provide sufficient insight into student learning. It doesn't present the full picture. It also highlights that the knowledge of academic vocabulary and review and test-taking skills is potentially more important than actually learning historical material. In the interest of time, we're going to explore 2 students in depth. We explore all 4 students in the manuscript, and we hope that you will read that when it is published. So we're going to first focus on Priya, who is the perfect student. She presents as the perfect student. She is 17 years old. She's moved to the United States a year prior. This is her first history class. English, she says, is her second language. She takes copious notes. She sits in the front of the classroom. She writes word for word what is on every single PowerPoint slide. She frequently raises her hands to answer Mrs. Book's question, to the point that Mrs. Book has to say, anyone but Preya. Preya's on fire. We need to get more people involved. She's answering all of these questions. She's taking all of the notes. She turns in every single assignment. However, Preya struggles on the assessment. One of the assessment questions asked, what was the name of the federal regulatory agency established in 1917 that encouraged companies to use mass production techniques and eliminate waste, and also applied price controls on certain industrial goods? The answer is War Industries Board. Preya has taken notes both on the chapter 19 from the textbook and from Mrs. Book's PowerPoint. In one of the notes, it says the WB is established to regulate war-related industries and to encourage companies to use mass-produced techniques and eliminate waste. But she chose National War Labor Board. Two of the words are the same. There's very slight differences in this. In another question, it asked students, tensions between Germany and the United States grew because of, the correct answer is A, German submarine attacks. But Preya selects D, the threats to use U-boats. She goes on to say that when the Americans were helping the people, they were supplying goods to Great Britain, but Germany did not want the Americans to help the Britons. So the attacks on the boats so that the Americans get trapped from their attack, and then they would stop supplying Great Britain. She knows the answer. She's able to articulate content. She knows a little bit of the narrative as to what's happening, but she chooses really based on one word. It's this one or two word differences that's really going to make Preya choose one answer over the other. So she's a very studious individual. She presents as attentive in class. She takes unbelievable notes. She's always on task, and yet she scores a 68%. It's this one or two word, either it's vocabulary or that it's so similar to another answer that it really throws the students off. It throws Preya off. Min is very quiet and reserved. He sits near his friends. He's often talking with them on the audio recorders. We will hear him talking about video games, and then they'll switch into a quick academic conversation and then go right back to video games. He mostly takes notes based off of what his friends do. So he's not really looking up at the PowerPoint, but he'll look at his friends and then write down what's happening. He was absent for 2 of the days, and he was not observed talking to Mrs. Book about the absences or receiving any information about what happened, any of the PowerPoints or notes or anything. He did not submit any of the chapter 19 notes, and he doesn't always turn in his assignments. On one of the assessment questions, it asked students, the Tennessee trial of John T. Scopes in 1925 illustrated a conflict concerning. The correct answer is religious beliefs and science. And Min selects this, but his thinking through it differs from what happened in the classroom, and he relies on other forms. So he says that he learned this because he took notes on it. However, the students learned about the Scopes trial during a stations activity that they participated in, and there was a full station on the Scopes trial. When asked what he would have written down in the notes, he explains a little more, and he says he actually had to research a little bit about it because he wasn't sure why people were suing John Scopes, and he didn't know what it meant to be sued. So he has to do more research outside of class. And this follows a pattern of many other questions. If he doesn't know what a term is, he looks it up and then he creates a flashcard for it. Or then he goes and he asks his friends, not Mrs. Book, what's a simpler word for this? What does this mean? And so then he ends the unit with a stack of vocabulary terms that he will use to study. So Min is really reliant on his friends to provide definitions for vocabulary. He scores a 71 on the test, which is higher than what Preya scores. He copies notes from his friends. He creates these flashcards and relies on a lot of vocabulary skills, not necessarily historic content, to pass the test. Arya and Shannon, just briefly, Arya actually scored the highest, and she tells us point blank she doesn't care about history just wants to pass the SOL test to get the credit. She's on her cell phone for most of the class. She's talking with friends. And she says when she's studying, she just takes the review sheet and she does test taking strategies. These two are similar, so it should probably be one of these answers. Or, I can eliminate answer D because of this. But the content is not there. She doesn't retain the content. In fact, her scores go down from the post-test to the interview that she participated in. Shannon scored a 78 test. She looks very studious. If you look at the video cameras, if you look at our field notes, she always has a pen onto paper. But then when we go to look at her notes, it's mostly doodles. So she's very much into art. She's, drawing sketches of animals, of her friends. She loves talking with her friends. The study is taking place a couple weeks before prom, and she switches between conversation about which prom dress they're going to wear to back to the 1920s and then back to prom dress. She also leans on the review test to prepare for the test. She just makes sure that she knows all of those terms, but she doesn't rely on any notes, or she rarely mentioned anything that happened in the classroom. So the question becomes, did students learn? So we look at two different definitions of what it means to learn. So Hattie and Yates argue that it is developing sufficient surface knowledge, an idea or ideas to form conceptual understanding by relating ideas and extending ideas. Van Sledwright and Lamone provide us with a structure of historic learning. So there are first order concepts that gives us the who, what, where, when, why. The second order concepts, these historic concepts, evidence, significance. And then we look at strategic knowledge, the skills, the historical thinking skills. So based on these definitions, did Preya, Min, Shannon, and Arya learn? They didn't learn any strategic knowledge. That wasn't present in the classroom. But it becomes complicated past that. Multiple choice tests are clearly an imperfect measure of student learning. That has been shown in previous research studies. Our results in interviews indicate that they may have learned some factual knowledge, some first order knowledge, but it's not enough to develop any conceptual understandings and really to develop a larger narrative of what happened in World War I, the 1920s, or the Great Depression. Also, teaching to the test didn't really work. We look at numerous classrooms in different research studies or classrooms that we observe. Many teachers rely on lectures because they think it works for getting the content to students, but it doesn't always work. The instruction and assessments were not designed for multilingual learners. Mrs. Book did not seem to know the WIDA scores or who was being provided services or even their linguistic backgrounds. The tricky academic vocabulary led the multilingual learners to the incorrect answers. For Preya, she could talk about it and she knew the content in the interviews, but on the test, she's going to the wrong answers because of one or two words. Min, Arya, and Shannon are relying almost solely on a review sheet to create flashcards and on academic vocabulary and test-taking skills. The implications is that we need to consider more authentic assessment tasks and manageable formative assessments. Mrs. Book has 120 students that she sees every single day. How can we have more formative assessments, check-ins with students, besides just multiple choice quizzes and completion? What are different ways that teachers can get to what students know in a manageable format? We also need to consider the explicit vocabulary instruction and language scaffolding for all students, but particularly these multilingual learners. What are the terms that the students might not know? How do we check in that they're getting the academic vocabulary as well as the historic content? We argue that there should be attention to teacher as a curricular instructional assessment gatekeeper. Thornton's notion of a curricular instructional gatekeeper has been formative in social studies research, but we need to extend it to assessment to get to S.G. Grant's point is, how do we know what students know? If a teacher is going to teach to the test, it needs to be done with their students in mind. How is this teaching beneficial for Preya, Min, Arya, and Shannon? Thank you so much for watching this. We hope that you are able to read and enjoy our work that is forthcoming in TRSE, and we look forward to any comments that you might have. Thank you so much.